I'm not going to claim to be done in 2 to 5 minutes tonight, but I will try to be done before I start getting too many signals. I'm the second sick speaker coming in late from the Valley tonight, and I have the difficult task of wrapping up following all of these amazing presentations. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to bring things back to the terror list. Our presenters have shown very forcefully that the terror list of the Canadian state is not an instrument of public safety, but is really a weapon of repression. And I'm going to talk about some of the context around the list, and in particular, the terror list in a range of legislation that is developed on an associational basis. Legislation that criminalizes people not because they've done a particular act, engaged in a certain activity, done something that violates a law or some sort of standard, but in fact criminalizes them just because they have an association, a connection, some sort of ephemeral or questionable, even ambiguous relationship with a group, an organization, or a collective that has been pre-identified by the state as being a criminal group or a terrorist group. And on that basis, even if your association is simply wearing group colors or carrying group information or passing out a group newspaper or something like that, you can be criminalized, you can be arrested, you can be detained, and you can be subject to punishment and criminalization. We can look at the emergence of this associational legislation going back well before 2011 and 2001, and 9/11 attacks. We can look at, in 2001, the anti-gang laws that were put together by then the Liberal government, the Liberal federal government in Canada, which, using a moral panic around public constructions of fear around the Hells Angels and bike gangs, passed legislation that identified criminal gang groups, like the Angels, for example, and then allowed the state to criminalize people by association. So if someone was wearing colors or wearing the patch, then they had an association with the group, they could be arrested, they could be detained, they could have their assets seized, and so forth. Right? Now, this very quickly shifted out of that proposed beginning around gangs and to show the political character of it, and was taken over into attempts to apply it to groups that were doing community organizing and engaged in resistance within the Canadian state context. So one example, I was involved at the time with an anti-poverty organization in Toronto, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, a direct action anti-poverty organization that engaged in defense of homeless people, defense of tenants who were faced with eviction, defense of people facing deportation, and so forth. And after the gang laws were passed, then Chief of Toronto Police, rather notorious character, one Julian Fantino, who's gone on to become a minister in the Conservative government, proposed that OCAP should be designated as a gang, that we were a criminal gang. Why was this? Well, because we engaged in direct action. And in the summer of 2001, we had faced with a nasty finance minister. Well, I guess they're all nasty, but a particular nasty finance minister in Ontario who's gone on to become a particularly nasty finance minister federally, one Jim Flaherty, the current finance minister. He had had a range of positions. He had been this sort of fixer person. Whenever they had a tough, nasty job to do to impose legislation on people, they put him into position. And he had been the housing minister previously in Ontario, and he had been responsible for killing rent controls and passing legislation that was leading to thousands of people being evicted in the province every month. And so we decided that we wanted to give him a sense of what an eviction felt like. And we went to his constituency office and we evicted him. We took all of his furniture and his files and everything in his office and threw them out in the lawn. I guess this could be considered a criminal activity. He certainly went on TV and publicly cried and complained that we were un-Canadian. And this moved from OCAP They also started talking about applying this gang legislation to warrior societies. And they talked about Mohawk warriors at Akwesasne. And they used arguments around smuggling of tobacco and so forth, which is a particularly nasty thing where you run a border through people's community, and then when they try and go from one part of their community to another, you say, that's smuggling, right? You're trafficking across the border. Well, you know. And then, of course, they took this further to say, well, the warrior societies, self-defense organizations are criminal organizations. They should be classified as gangs and so forth. Now, before they could bring this sort of logic forward, and Fantino was drumming up some support in the Toronto context for having OCAP brought into this legislation. Before that could happen, of course, we get 9/11. Right, later that year. And then the shift, it gives the government a chance to up the ante even further. Now we can move away from calling them gangs. Now we can call them terrorists and get a really big payoff, right? Prior to 9/11, the notion of a terrorist act had fairly restricted use in Canadian law, and it was notably used within the Immigration Act. It was present within the Immigration Act, giving immigration officials the right to expel or deny entry to non-Canadians who were charged with participation in a terrorist act, right? And legal scholars, one of the reasons for this limited application was that legal scholars had suggested it would be really difficult to construct a definition of terrorism that could withstand a court challenge, and precisely because it could overflow into a whole range of activities that weren't actually terrorist activities. And we have to remember the meaning of terrorism. I'll get into that in a second, yeah. And of course, the criminal code already had provisions, right, around bombing and assassination and things. You couldn't do those things. They were already criminalized, right? You didn't need to identify them as being terrorist or to have an additional act around that. So a couple of other things in terms of association just before I wrap up. In addition to the most noted legislation, the Anti-Terror Act, they also brought in a Public Safety Act, a Bill C-42 when it first came in. And the idea there was that the state could simply declare martial law in any area where essentially they believe that organizing resistance activities might be occurring. And they threatened to use it specifically around meetings like the G8 and the G20. They threatened to use it at the meetings at Kananaskis, where they would simply impose martial law in the whole area. And anyone who couldn't say, well, I live here, or show proof that they lived there or worked there, you didn't have cause to be there. Now you can be arrested and you can be detained. We saw a similar thing in Toronto around the G20 protests when they brought out this archaic act from the 1930s, which had been brought in around the public works. The idea in the 1930s, they didn't want sabotage of public facilities or something like that. So they bring that back in the context of this meeting of global elites, global capital, and their state reps. And they say, well, the whole area where the event could be taking place, they fence off a large area of the city, and then say that whole area is a public work, and if you're caught within a certain distance, a certain proximity of that, then you can be subjected to arrest and detention and so forth. And then they just arbitrarily decide that, well, now actually it doesn't have to be right near the fence, but maybe it's a few blocks away, or it's in a park or whatever, and so forth. So another way of engaging these sort of associational laws. Now, the thing about the associational legislation that we might want to keep in mind in terms of how this is an effective weapon for the state is that it does away with a range of safeguards that people might expect as being part of due process within a liberal democratic context, right? Due process, the right to the presumption of innocence, the habeas corpus even in some cases, and so forth, right? It takes that away. They don't have to have to take on those sorts of protections because you're an association. You don't actually have to have been involved in a particular activity. So just in wrapping up, a couple of things. One, I think it's useful to remember what the term terror arises from and where it comes from. The term terror and the notion of terrorism actually comes out of the period around the French Revolution and was used to describe state activities, state violence inflicted against, well, anyone that they deemed to be an opponent to state rule, right? it has, by political sleight of hand, this definition of terrorism as what the state does, has become, by political sleight of hand, flip-flopped. So now activities of people defending themselves against the violence of the state comes to be defined as terrorism. That's a powerful ideological tool for the state. And finally, I'll just end here, and I'll suggest that people stick around and bring forward questions, and please speak with the speakers, speak with Red Sparks folks, both in terms of taking this very small step that we've sort of initiated tonight, which is a public call to end the terror list, but also in terms of the larger steps in developing resistance and solidarity going forward. Thank you.